Hi guys, thank you so much for tuning in. Welcome back to my channel. And yes, today I'm in conversation with Dr. Vikram Sampath. I'm sure I don't need to say anything more about him, but I would just like to read out a few things about him. His book, Splendors of Royal Mysore, My Name is Gauhar Jan, and his two versions on Savarkar, which is published by Penguin Random House, has become a national bestseller and is acclaimed by Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Today I'm not only going to talk to him about his books, but about his views on history, his journey as a writer. So come, let us talk. Welcome to my channel. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be talking to you.
Thank you so much, sir. So my first question is, why is it so difficult in today's day and age to write objective biographies? In one of your interviews, you said that in colonial India, historians could present an unbiased history, but in independent India, it's not possible. What was the reason that you made such a statement?
Well, if you actually look at the history of Indian history writing, historiography is what we call it. During the colonial times, you of course had during the British time the Oriental kind of history, which William Jones and others, who saw India as this exotic, country and with so many cultures and traditions that they didn't understand. So how to explore those? So you had the Asiatic Society of Bengal and all that came up during that time, that looked at India as from the Orientalist viewpoint. Alongside, you also had a colonial and missionary kind of history, which spoke largely about India with derision, which was used also as a tool for conversions and so on, saying this is a very primitive culture, this needs software update, so to say. But in response to all of that, and that was what was so important, that even under the British rule, you had a nationalistic school of history writing under several Indian historians like R.C. Majumdar, you had V.K. Rajwade, you had Jadunath Sarkar, Savarkar, many others who kind of wrote India's history from an Indian perspective. And this constantly challenged the colonial narrative that was there. Now, sadly, after independence, largely the narrative of Indian history writing has been captured by political ideologies, and you see how easily all our conflicts today are around history. And it's so ironic that in a country which has so little regard, for history or for protection of monuments and so on, or even the way we present our past to ourselves and also to people from other countries, history becomes such a touchy subject. You write a history of a biography of, say, Shivaji, then that whole Bhandarkar library in Pune is attacked. You can't write an objective biography of, say, Ambedkar, Periyar. All these characters have just become holy cows, so to say, that anybody who doesn't subscribe to this left wing and right wing and all these ideologies of history, they get attacked constantly, saying it has to subscribe to one view. And largely, I feel the biggest disservice that was done to Indian historiography was the Marxist school, which has captured Indian history writing, eliminating all kind of differing viewpoints that one may have. Because history is a very subjective, discipline. There is nothing called as absolute truth. You may discover something about the same subject. I may have done 25 years of research, but your one discovery can overturn my 25 years of research and something new could come about. So there needs to be that space for dissent, for differing viewpoints, which unfortunately has not been there. So both these things, the discipline itself, the toxification of the discipline due to the control of one particular political ideology, and secondly, the fact that we've made history and biographies thereby so intertwined with contemporary politics that it becomes very difficult to be objective, to not fall into trouble if you write anything about anyone. I had, in my first book, Splendors of Royal Mysore, there's just one portion about Tipu Sultan. Now, Tipu Sultan today is again someone who's been appropriated by the left, by so many other, the Congress and so many political formations. So I'd written, in fact, an article in a leading newspaper, and that there was such a lot of furor. There was my effigy that got burnt because I had apparently not been very kind to Tipu Sultan. But these were all based on sources. These were all based on primary research that I had done for 10 long years. So that becomes the problem. Aurangzeb, Tipu Sultan, as I said, Ambedkar, Periyar, Shivaji, all these characters of the past who are very, very fascinating, enigmatic characters, to be able to dispassionately analyze them has become a huge problem in today's India. And sooner we dispose of that, I think history is a casualty in the process. Our future generations will not know the story as it needs to be told. So I think it's very important that we free this discipline from the clutches of political control and ideology that it finds itself in.
So why do you feel a large part of Indian history really does not find an appropriate place in the history books? For example, in the 2000 years of Indian history, why very little is written about South India and everything is very Delhi based?
You're a Delhi lover, so you would love the history that is there in our textbooks. Because I studied CBSE and NCERT textbooks. Even it's like a constant linear history of various dynasties which ruled Delhi. Right from the slave dynasty to Khiljis and obscure dynasties like Lodhis and all that find such a big mention in our history books. But then what about the northeast of India? Did nothing happen in that part of India for 5,000 years? You had the Ahom dynasty of Assam, which ruled that place for 600 years. Some of the bravest, soldiers. You had this man called Lachit Borphukan, who actually drew the Mughals into a naval battle and defeated them. These people don't find a mention there at all. The royal family of Tripura, which still exists there. Come down south, dynasties like the Cholas, under Rajaraja Chola and Rajendra Chola, you had the Cholas expand all the way up to Southeast Asia. India had the most powerful naval fleet under the Cholas. The Cholas also went and also occupied up to the Gangetic Plains. So the expanse of the empire from the Gangetic Plains to Southeast Asia, but how much of space is devoted? Maybe a couple of paragraphs in a history textbook, but the might of the Chola Empire is never brought out. Vijayanagar also, Krishnadevaraya, if I would see the Vijayanagar Empire in comparison to, say, the Mughal Empire, and Krishnadevaraya is not called Krishnadevaraya the Great, it's always Akbar the Great. So what about the renaissance that happened in South India, in art, in culture, in the economic resurgence that South India saw? Hampi doesn't even find a mention, I'm told, in current 7th standard NCERT textbooks, or it's just like a footnote somewhere. This was a town where foreign travelers have come and told us that diamonds were sold on the streets of Hampi. That was the economic power of this place, but that doesn't find a mention. I'm from Bangalore. This part of the country was ruled by the Wadayars of Mysore, and they ruled again for 600 years. We don't find their mention at all. And smaller places like Goa or Sikkim or all these places, a lot of that doesn't find any mention in our history textbooks. So India, I think, needs to grab back its narrative from the narrative of Delhi. It's great to have the narrative of Delhi, but that's not what India is all about. I think India is too vast a country with too many, aspects to it. The other aspect that I find very, disconcerting with the way our history is presented is we're constantly told that we are a land of losers. All the battles that we are taught, one after the other, whether it was the Battle of Panipat, whether it was Battle of Plassey, Battle of Tarain, Battle of Buxar, Indians always seem to be losing the battle. Now today, after so many thousands of years, if we are still around as a civilization, there must have been some battles that we won also. So where are mentions of these battles? So this again comes to what I was mentioning, the colonial narrative of Indian history, where it was our colonial masters who removed from our narrative all stories of our successes. So they had to show that you are a very inferior race. You have always been losing. You've always had foreigners come and take over you, right from the so-called, mythical Aryan invasion theory till the time the British came and took over. So it's your destiny to be ruled by others. So, but then I'll give you a couple of examples. If you see Muhammad of Ghazni came, I think, in 1020, 1025. I'm very bad with dates for a historian. But and then the next invasion from the Turkic forces happened in, I think, 1192 by Ghori. So in between, you had 175 years So what happened then? So why didn't the Turkic forces come? So our history textbooks don't even talk of the fact that somewhere in 1033, you had Mahmud Ghazni's nephew who came overriding the entire Gangetic plains, and he was beaten black and blue by a local king of the Gangetic plains called Suhail Dev Pasi in what is known as the Battle of Behruch. Now, this would have been a it was such a bad and humiliating defeat that the Turkic forces never dared to look towards India for 175 years till Ghori came back again after regrouping themselves. So why does, how many of us have read about Suhail Dev Pasi in our textbooks? I don't think anybody even knows the name. Similarly, you had much later in the 18th century, you had Martanda Varma in Kerala, small little state of Travancore on the southern tip of India. Now this man gives like a death blow to the Dutch East India Company, which was on an expansionist rise all over the world. And in the Battle of Kolachal, which was I think in 1732 or 33, the Dutch are defeated so badly that they lose their global status as a trading company, and that was what led to the resurgence or the emergence of the British East India Company. So this was a very important epoch in not only Indian history but world history, where a small king in a small little province is able to defeat a European power like the Dutch East India Company. But nobody even knows who this guy Martanda Varma is. Our history textbooks don't talk about him. So what are these stories? Rani Abbakka in Ullar in Karnataka defeated the Portuguese, a woman who managed to defeat the Portuguese and get them out of the coastal areas of Karnataka. Now, these are all stories which we need to celebrate, not with a sense of jingoism that Mera Bharat Mahan kind of a thing, but these are real stories, which, as I said, we are not a country only limited to Delhi. We are not a country only of losers. We are not a country who have been born to be ruled by others. And this was a colonial narrative, a colonial construct that was done. And sadly, after independence, we have only continued to, perpetuate this story rather than making any efforts to correct the history that our erstwhile colonial masters gave to us.
These days, the younger generation, they come up with this historical fiction and they change history to suit their stories. So you think that, as you said, half of the history is not mentioned in the books. Now the other half has been distorted by them. So what will the future generation really read?
No, I have nothing against historical fiction, because I think that has its own, it's a separate genre by itself. And so I think it takes into account, a historical context and maybe, makes a story out of it. And there's no claim that it is true history. The very name says it's historical fiction. So anybody who's reading it would know that it's a fictional account. What is troublesome and problematic is true history that gets distorted. I have no problem with historical fiction, but the works that masquerade as history, which then have so many biases, like I mentioned, or so many distortions, that becomes the problematic scenario where you're right, the future generations will not be able to know. As I mentioned some examples, so many names, so many dynasties, so many heroes and heroines of our past, unless there is corrective action. And two ways this can be corrected is, one is the government steps up of whichever party and rule that, our textbooks need an urgent, revision and rewriting, again, without all these ideological and party biases. But then, including the current government, I don't think has any intention to do any such thing, because you had the previous education minister, Prakash Javadekar, who went on and said, we have not changed a single word in our history textbooks, as if that's a great matter of pride. So either the history textbooks change, or people, individuals like me and several others, take the effort of rewriting that history and being able to make that accessible also. There has to be impeccable research on the one hand, but a research which is also accessible. I think when you ask young people, do you read history textbooks? I'm sure many of them would frown and say no, because that's the way I think history is taught in our schools in such a boring manner. In fact, must admit that even I hated history as a subject in school, and it always, a history class meant I would be kneeling outside because I just couldn't memorize all those dates of who succeeded whom and all that. So it's a lot of rote learning, lot of silly information which is of no use to anybody. That's how it's taught. So I think that more people who need to write these books or these stories in a very interesting, there's so much of intrigue and drama and wars and romance and all of that storytelling that's there in our past. I think this needs to be put together in a way that young people are not only able to read but also be inspired. You see a resurgence in the way our mythology is being consumed, right? I mean, with writers like Amish Tripathi and Ashwin Sanghi and others who are writing about the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, and all of these epics. Similarly, I do see there is a resurgence in interest in our past. If it is presented in a nice and interesting way, without all those thousands of footnotes, which usually come to in our actual history books. Of course, notes can come as end notes where you also show that you have done a lot of research, but in a very engaging narrative manner, then I think a lot of young people would love to know about our own past.
You wrote about Gauhar Jaan, and in one of your interviews I read where you said that I would feel like I was looking for a needle in a haystack. So where did you do your research? These are figures about whom not much is known. So where do you do your research from?
I wish I had an answer to that, because there is no fixed route to research. It just develops or evolves on the way. So I was researching on my first book on the history of Mysore, Splendors of Royal Mysore, and that's when, while doing the research in the Palace Library, I came across this reference of this woman it was mentioned in a box file in the Palace records of visiting musicians who came to Mysore. And she had lived there for 2 years and she died in Mysore. And the box file had very little information about her. It said she was an Armenian Christian who later converted to Islam and became Gauhar Jaan. And she was India's first artist to record commercially on the gramophone in 1902. And she was the first mega superstar and this and that. All that was mentioned about her in about a paragraph. And then there were these letters of hers which spoke about, pleading the Maharaja of Mysore, saying, please increase my salary, don't cut my income tax and all of that. And so somewhere, on an instinct, I felt that this is one story. And then she dies in the KR hospital in Mysore. And I actually went to the KR hospital, impersonating as her grandson, trying to find even her death certificate. But then, I did get the death certificate, but it said reason of death unknown. So it was very intriguing, and I felt this was one story that was dying to be told. And so over the next 4 years, I literally, chased her story rather, from the place she was born in Azamgarh, and then to Banaras where she lived, then to Calcutta where she belonged, largely, spent her life. She was known as Gauhar Jaan of Calcutta. Then to all the riyasats that she performed in, Darbhanga, Rampur, then Bombay where she lived, Madras, then Mysore. Also went to Berlin because the German agent who had come to record her for the gramophone company, he was a German called Frederick William Gaisberg. Now he had a diary where he wrote about how she bargained for extra, remuneration. She charged 2,000 rupees for a recording session in those days in 1902, which was quite a sum. So all those details, how she came dressed in all her regal finery and all this in his diary in Berlin. Then there was a collection of Urdu poetry of her mother, Badi Malka Jaan, which, what a sad, spectacle. The only copy of that I found in London. This was known as Makhzan-e Ulfat-e Mallika, or the treasure trove of Malka's love. So exquisite, about 500 ghazals which she had written. So being a Tawayef, she had no legal heirs, and she had no students and all that. So that's why I think I mentioned that it was looking for a needle in a haystack, where you don't know where. It's just an interest in the subject, but how to go about it, the whole research journey, one just doesn't know. One thing leads to the other, and it's like that. At the end of it, maybe you may find light at the end of the tunnel, or you may not at all. So, for instance, while researching in Calcutta, I came to know that there were 2 cases that she fought in her life. One in which she had to also prove her parentage in court, that she was actually her mother's true daughter. Now, this would have been an important case in the Calcutta High Court, so I went to the Calcutta High Court. Now, the Calcutta High Court, while shifting its premises, they had taken all the old documents and made a bonfire out of it, which were considered as unimportant. So in that, Gauhar Jan's records were also burned somewhere. But somebody in the court told me that there was one peon or somebody official in the court. His name was Chitragupta, and he was a great music lover, and he might be someone who had copies of the Gauhar Jan papers. So I went looking for this Chitragupta all over Calcutta, finally managed to trace him down, and as luck could have it, Mr. Chitragupta was dead. And so his wife was quite an old lady, but she was quite upset about who's this person coming from Bangalore trying to find out, her husband. She got scared perhaps that I'm trying to say you've stolen documents from the court or whatever. So she refused. She threw me out several times till, it was beg and plead and all of that. And then she finally, threw those things saying, "Leke jao, don't show me your face again." So that entire set of papers became an important source for, tracing Gauhar's lineage and who her parents were, her grandparents and all of that. So this is what I say. It's almost like an investigative journalism, the research trail, where at the start of it, I don't know, I may succeed, I may fail, but that's the whole, the intellectual joy that it gives, the thrill of research, where one thing leads to the other somewhere and you make very unexpected discoveries.
Sir, another thing is that I read that you fall in love with your characters emotionally. So how do you disconnect with them once the biography is over?
Yeah, that's also a very nice question, because see, as a biographer, it's not possible not to fall in love with the subject. I've always called the process of writing a biography like a love affair. You fall in love with the subject, and that's why you're willing to invest your time, your emotions, your money, and all of that into the whole research process. So initially, and just like in a love affair, you chase the object of your interest. So similarly, you actually chase the subject, you gather as much, and you stalk them, not on social media, but then you actually stalk them in archives and libraries, find out all their letters, all their documents. And in the process, sometimes, the love affair might just end. You might get disillusioned saying this is not really worth my time, or it's happened to me too many times. There've been interest areas, but I start the research and then it's not really such a great story to be told. So let's ditch the whole process. So that also happens. But then if you continue and then gather the whole, story, I think for it, there's a very thin line between a biography and a hagiography, where you're extolling your subject, beyond measure. So to be able to not slip into a hagiography, it's very important in the last step of the biography process that one disconnects emotionally and also talks about the darker sides of your character. And it is only possible. Everybody is human. We all have our pluses and negatives, our white and black elements. We are all fuzzy, shades of gray. So putting that out is very, very important, and that one has to very conscientiously keep that in mind. That you have to be an unbiased chronicler who talks about not only the good things, not become a lawyer for your character, but also bring out some of the negative aspects of the character. So, but then after the biography is over, honestly, it takes a long time to actually get over the subject. It's almost like a love affair has ended, and you still ruminate about the person for a long time till another person catches your fancy. So I've often said that I think with every biography, a biographer, I think, dies multiple deaths, because you have lived through the ups and downs of an entire life. You have lived their joys, their sorrows, their ups, their downs, their death, and then there is that sense of void that does set in, that, oh God, this story is over. So what do I now do? I've invested so much of my time and emotion into this. Now what to do? And then someone else catches your interest. So that's, I think, how one gets out of the cycle.
I have another question. You've written this book on Savarkar. Why did you choose this topic? And if you could share something about this book.
Yeah. So this is actually the first of a 2-volume biography. Savarkar Echoes from a Forgotten Past, which Penguin has come out with. It came out in August 2019. And you see, in the first question, we spoke about narratives of history, how so many things have been forgotten. I think in that context, also, what is important that comes to light is the history of our freedom struggle. So there's a very, very linear, simplistic, monochromatic narrative of a non-violent struggle of our freedom, and again to suit one particular political narrative. Whereas there were multiple, parallel struggles for freedom, which also included the armed revolts, right from the 1857 War of Independence till the naval mutiny of 1946, which Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose and the Indian National Army led, which is what got India her freedom. Now, in this long list of armed struggle, a very important character was Veer Savarkar. Now, Veer Savarkar, on the one hand, he was a revolutionary who spearheaded India's movement in the early 20th century for armed struggle. But also, I think what makes him more important is he's the one who founded the whole theory or popularized the whole theory of Hindutva. Which is what is the ruling political ideology today in India, and that makes him more contentious, more controversial. Almost every third day you have somebody or the other talking about him in news channels. All the debates on prime time are around this. So Rahul Gandhi will mock him, then Prime Minister Modi goes all the way to cellular jail in the Andamans, where he was incarcerated for 12 long years and pays his tribute. So back and forth, was he a coward? Was he a veer? All these different things keep shuttling between various political. He's become a political football. Now, my interest in him was awakened way back in 2004 when his portrait was first unveiled in Parliament by the Vajpayee government. And also around the same time, there was a plaque in his honor, which was put up in the cellular jail. But 1 year later, when the UPA came to power, you had the then Minister Manishankar Iyer, who got that removed. And then he said, this guy is a British stooge, he's a coward, and so we don't need to commemorate him. So something, as I said, characters that are either forgotten or maligned this way or misunderstood, they always catch my attention. And that's how I was really, really intrigued to find out more about Veer Savarkar, and over several years I managed to gather a lot of information about him from archives in India, from archives abroad, and also Marathi literature, which he wrote prolifically in Marathi himself. And the picture that comes is very different as what is portrayed to us either in media or whatever little or almost he's absent from our history textbooks. So along with him, so many other names of the armed struggle of Indian freedom. Vasudev Balwant Phadke, then Chapekar brothers, you had Shyamji Krishna Verma, Madam Hikaji Kama, Virendranath Chattopadhyay, Madan Lal Dhingra, MPT Acharya, VVS Iyer. Then of course you had Sachindranath Sanyal and the HSRA, Bhagat Singh, Sukhdev, Rajguru, Chandrasekhar Azad, Jatin Das, Bagha Jatin, all these, Surjo Sen in the Chittagong case, and of course leading to Rash Bihari Bose and the Subhash Chandra Bose. So this whole story of armed revolt, I think that also needed to be told somewhere. So keeping Savarkar as the foil, I'm also bringing out in these 2 volumes the growth of a parallel narrative of Indian freedom struggle, and also this whole concept of Hindutva. What exactly was Hindutva? Why did it come up? How did it stand in opposition to Gandhian philosophy? Why did it gain momentum? And Savarkar's own role as the president of the Hindu Mahasabha, and his role in partition or before that. Then, of course, he was also implicated in Gandhi's murder, which he was acquitted of. But then that whole long shadow of Gandhi's murder also hangs on him. And so even today, you have political parties which have been claiming for a Bharat Ratna for him. But then those in opposition say someone who's been implicated in Gandhi's murder, should he get the Bharat Ratna? So much is spoken about him, but so little written, about someone you either love a lot or hate a lot. I think you should love or hate someone only after having enough information about that person. So the last book on Savarkar was written way back in the 1960s by this man called Dhananjay Keer. After that, there was no biography of his written by people at all. So I think that was one reason I thought, as a historian, it's my duty to bring to light all these records that are actually screaming their lungs off to be heard and to be told. The story needed to be told, and that's how the book came out. And the very fact that within a few hours of it actually coming online, it went on to become an Amazon bestseller, and it has continued to be. The Penguin has titled it as a national bestseller. So far, we've gone into 6 or 7 editions already in a couple of months. It just goes to show that there is a thirst, there is a hunger for these stories in people, particularly young people, to actually read. So it's an opportunity also for historians to encash upon those aspects of our history which have never been told, which deserve to be, to your earlier question of future generations, which they need to be informed about.
I think it was a real insight. First of all, I love the part where you said that we need to change our history books, because I, as a student, used to hate history as a subject because of the dates and so much of learning. And with the notes, you sit the whole day and you keep mugging them up without making any sense to you. I love that part, what you said, and the rest of it also. Especially your Hercules Poirot part, where you kept talking from one part to the other. It was just wonderful, sir, talking to you.
Thank you so very much.
So guys, I was in conversation with Mr. Vikram Sampath. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Do share your views and comments. If you have any questions, email me on my email address given below. And yes, don't forget to subscribe. I post in videos 4 times a week: Wednesday, Thursday, Saturday and Sunday, 7:30 p.m. And yes, do tune in. I'll be waiting, and take care of yourself. Bye.